we're back, jumping right into our COVID-19 update. And for our first conversation this morning, we are going to be speaking about domestic violence and the options which may be available to you if you are going through a situation involving domestic violence. And here to talk to us about that, we have the Executive Director of the National Women's Commission, Ms. Cynthia Williams. Good morning, Cynthia, and thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Marlene.
We're with Gavin this morning, yes.
Gavin, sorry.
Yes. No, that's okay.
I'm still not familiar with your name. But thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's important that these sort of topics remain and continuously being providing information for the general public. As you rightly said, during this specific time that we're living, COVID-19 and the quarantine, it definitely increases the risk for many persons. And I would like to add also, not only in terms of domestic violence, but also just violence in a whole, and in children particularly as well, since they are home as well, and often they can be even more at risk.
Absolutely. Cynthia, this is an alarm that is sounding across the world. In fact, some countries that are further into their quarantine or lockdown or shutdown are recording some of the highest numbers they've seen for domestic violence. And in fact, they're kind of trying to get messages out. For us, we're just at the start. And I wanted to ask, have we seen anything or heard anything to have you feel that we may be facing the same situation here?
Well, there have been more narratives in terms of some of the incidents. We have to understand also that in terms of our experience, not many people report this type of incidents still yet. These are still very private, and those who reach out are those who might be on the verge of making a decision of either leaving or just getting information to see what their options are. Yeah. So we, as far as data, we haven't not received conclusive data. Women's Department, which I had hoped would have been able to be a part of the discussion, of course, they're very much into the response and trying to develop strategies that can work during this time. But we know that often these sort of instances go unreported.
Yeah, but we do get regular reports on a yearly basis, though. So it's my understanding that we have around 2,000 reports a year, each year in Belize.
Yes, for the past 3 years, since 2016, that we have been looking at, it's over 2,000. We don't have the data for 2019. We're working on getting the final data. Normally with these type of reports, you have to make sure you always go back and review and ensure that the numbers are correct. But definitely those are the numbers over the last 3 years, 2016, that have been reported so far.
So help us understand, and while for some people it might be a no-brainer, some of us may need better clarification. Why is this time of being locked in at home such a dangerous time for people who are in abusive relationships?
Well, one of the things that people have to understand is the fact that being in confined spaces adds to already stress that we are living. Yeah. So we know families are experiencing a lot of stress. For example, the reduction of income, the loss of income completely. We also have to look at just the fear and the lack of control that as individuals we have lost in so many ways. And so for persons who use power and control, those who perpetrate violence, it adds yet another layer of them trying to ensure that they retain that power and control. And so often it takes even less triggers or for them to be able to respond violently. And so women are staying at home, victims are staying at home. They no longer have the ability to access services as before, because maybe in the past when we were not in quarantine, they were able to go to seek services and information when they dropped off their kids at home, or if they were running around doing errands or whatever it is that they were able to do outside. That has been reduced. That is no longer available. We also have to look at the aspect that even now, while, for example, the women's department still remains open, that may likely close as we continue experiencing more cases of COVID. And so that reduces access to services directly. But what they are working on is trying to retain services that safeguard safety of individuals and provision of health and basic needs. So that still will continue even if their offices close. And so we definitely have to look at the amount of time and stress that's added within the family, and that then becomes even more triggers for perpetrators of violence.
So, what you're saying, I mean, I never thought of it that way. So it's not just being the challenge of all the stress that one may be going through, but it's also the opportunities to get help or to get information that's been stripped from these women, or from the victims, because they can't move around. So if I used to take the time when my husband goes to work to maybe stop in at the women's department and ask what I can do, I can't do that anymore.
No, they can't. And also because you have to understand, there's quite a lot of fear surrounding COVID-19, even though we keep putting messages out there that the spread of the disease is actually on our hands, whether we choose to continue practice good hygiene practices. But there's a lot of fear still yet. So persons would also choose not to access services or report for the fear that they might become in contact with the virus. So that's an added layer of why then the situation becomes more exacerbated.
Yeah. I read a report in the United States where, in fact, an abuser used it as a way of threatening their spouse, saying, I will lock you out of the house and you will get the disease. I'd imagine that that's a viable threat people can use even here.
Yes, definitely. And that was the other point that I was going to make in terms of the ways that they try to retain that power and control over their victims. And so it's not only in terms of using the virus as a threat, but also ensuring that even limit the access that victims have to services and also to materials such as sanitizing products and things like that. So sometimes the threat can extend that they will be kicked out of the house without their children. Those are possible threats that can be used. And again, we are using these examples based on what other countries have lived.
Yeah.
I've been reading, and actually there have been some cases where some women have been killed by their partners because of the perceived threat that they had acquired COVID from them, particularly talking about healthcare workers.
Wow.
I read a case in the UK, and I think there was another case in France. So that again poses another threat and risk, not only in general to those living in situations at home and staying at home, but even those working in the front line.
You know, as you're speaking, it also, it didn't, most people, I think when they hear about domestic issues, their mind automatically goes to physical abuse. But it's important that what you highlighted just now as well, in the sense that if you're living in a situation like this now within these close quarters, and if you are living with an abuser, that abuse can take many forms. And you know, as you mentioned, you were speaking about denying access to certain resources. It could even be money, because as you know, people are still allowed to go out and buy groceries or whatever, but they may be reducing that. And then also, of course, the psychological and emotional abuse, which may be inflicted on, you know, entire families, not just, you know, spouses or partners, but also children.
Right. And of course, then we also add other vulnerable populations. And I'm very glad that you're going to be having a discussion on the elderly, because that is another area that often is forgotten. And so we need to be able to help people understand the gravity of the situation and the risk that many families pose, a time where we're supposed to be coming together as families and being able to take care of each other. That may not be the situation for many families in Belize. And so it's important to highlight the different experiences of the elderly persons with disabilities, because even in their position, sometimes they may be dependent on care from their perpetrators. Yeah. So that puts them at a risk as well. So it's important for the community to be aware of what's the impact of such a virus on an already volatile situation, and what are some ways that they can also contribute and support those persons. Yes, we cannot come out, or it's better for us to stay at home, but then you are aware of numbers that can be called in case you know of your neighbor or a family member that is experiencing. So it's definitely an opportunity for all the different public entities to work closer, hand in hand, to respond to such issues, but also for the community to also take a bit of responsibility, more responsibility actually, and be more supportive to your families. Earlier this morning, you talked about, we have many spaces where we have to agree to disagree. And I think in some of these instances, this could be one of them. While we think that they should leave, we can't understand the dynamics of domestic violence and the many reasons why they remain to stay in such situations. But we need to provide that support to them, especially at this time.
Yeah, it's not a time to judge. It can be, I imagine, a critical situation. And you were saying that it's not just physical abuse and not just between spouses or partners. It could be to the children, it could be to the elderly. But also, I'd imagine there's quite a bit of psychological abuse that can take place as well.
Definitely, definitely. And I think this is where the threats come in, where they would not allowing them to even interact with families sometimes, especially because their families or friends might be the only outside information that some of these individuals who are living in these situations can get. And so definitely when we look at issue of domestic violence, it is a choice when we perpetrate violence, and so we have to be able to understand the dynamics of what it does to individuals psychologically, the way that often the threats and the different words that are used to minimize their human dignity or to let them know that nobody wants them or nobody will be able to help them. And in so many ways, the public, the media, family members and friends kind of build and add to that, because then that's the time when we leave them on their own.
Okay. And I want to go back to something that you were discussing earlier. So let's say that now that I'm required to be home, and because I'm home all day every day now, I may not live in an abusive household, but because I'm home now, I observe that perhaps my neighbor or somebody else in my close community is experiencing it, and perhaps I never did know before, but now that I'm in a position to observe, I see that there's abuse or violence or of some form going on. Do you have any recommendations of sort of specific things that persons can do if they do witness, domestic violence in their community?
Well, if for example, there is a particular incident of violence, definitely call the police for them to respond. It is important for us to be able to look at the gravity of the situation. Often you may hear shouts, you may think that there's something, and you might say, well, I don't think it's serious, or I don't think it's escalating, but we don't know what is happening inside that home. And so it's important, once you have any kind of idea that something is happening, to contact the police. It is also important to be able to become even supportive mechanisms for these individuals. So as neighbors, often what happens, because of the stigma and the shame, individuals don't reach out. So I often say, maybe engage them and say, even if you need something, let me know what I can do. If it means calling somebody or helping you to be able to get information, then do that. Yeah. Like I mentioned, at the moment, Women's Department continues to be open. However, they can call 227-7397 to get information. One of the things that we discussed in one of our conversations was the importance of drafting safety plans. Okay. And what that means is knowing exactly what you can do when these situations arise. And the Women's Department is one of the entities that can support you in that, because when it comes to safety plans, it is unique to each individual. What works for one person will not work for another. And so often neighbors can be part of those safety plans in terms of even identifying signs that they can put out without saying anything, specific words or specific actions that they can then provide for you, that you know that individual is in danger and requires support from the police. Because even when it comes to the communication, sometimes their telephones might be taken away. So it's very complex, and we have to kind of think about all the things that could be done, and every little bit really would help to save a life in that specific moment of time.
So if I'm in that situation at home, I can call the women's department and ask them to help me prepare a safety plan that works for me. What are some of the considerations that would go into creating that type of plan? And are you saying this is kind of the moment where I do what I have to do to just stay alive?
Yes, basically that's it, because we also have to consider the safety of children, and often children are involved. And so when it comes to that, we definitely the importance of maintaining that safety component for children as well. And so if, for example, even if now there might not be that situation that is dangerous, it is important for those persons to begin looking at what are the things that they can do. If they don't know, then this is where they can contact the Women's Department still yet and be given that information. The National Women's Commission is trying to provide that information to them through Facebook, but we know that not everyone has access to internet, especially being at home now and not having employment. That becomes even more limited for them. So we're trying to work with the media. And again, this is another time where partnerships are very important, to be able for the media then to also provide those the type of communication free of cost to those individuals, because that's maybe the only time that they can get it. So develop your safety plan. If possible and where possible, be able to identify persons that you can trust, that can provide that support emotionally as well. Because even when you were before this crisis, sometimes just speaking with people can help you to be able to let go of some of that stress. Because living in a situation where you don't know at what point someone will come, either mentally, psychologically, or physically abuse you, it can be very strenuous on yourself and emotionally. So even having that person to speak with you and listen non-judgmentally and provide information is important. So even if you want to know, it's important to also become aware, because unfortunately in our need to help, sometimes we may do more damage, because this is where we put our judgment in without even realizing. So become informed. There's quite a lot of information for those who have access, and be able to even what is it that you can do. If you can call the police for these persons, if they're unable to, then do that, and be able to then recognize at least the signs, and always try to place safety of children at the top as a priority.
So 2 scenarios I want to ask about directly involving the police. One, what's been the communication to them? Given the fact that we have the benefit of being late in our phase of facing COVID, we've seen what happens in other parts of the world where they have a definitive increase in domestic violence cases. Have we communicated to police and worked with them to be able to be responsive? Because we've always heard stories of perhaps people feeling like they've been dismissed when calling in to get help. Secondly, what if my abuser is a police officer? And that adds a different layer of threat. We've seen, again, right here in Belize, where that has been the case. What advice do you give to people in those scenarios?
In the first instance, and one of the responses in general that we're working at, not only with the Women's Department, the National Women's Commission, through its National Gender and Gender-Based Violence Committee, the police is a member of that committee. That on a yearly basis we look at what are the strategies that need to be strengthened, and those are some of the discussions that we've had within that body. And so if somebody they contact the police, and they don't get any response, then it's important for them to do so again. And if they have contact with other persons, for example, trusted persons, they can also ask them to call them on their behalf. I myself have had that experience, and so being able to have that communication now with police is kind of defining and strengthening the gender-based violence referral pathway. And what is that? That is basically the process that people can follow from beginning to end. And so at some point, being able to give that to the public so that they know who they can call in those instances. Um, COVID definitely has impacted a lot of interventions and a lot of activities that were programmed to be implemented this year because of us needing to be at home. And so one of the things that we're really trying to work with is being able to develop a complaint system when these instances where police or any other government entity that respond to gender-based violence do not respond, then we can begin to document that. And as an advocacy body, be able to direct these questions and these issues to the entities themselves. And if that doesn't work, then being able to take that to the higher levels of government. And so we're trying to see and look at ways of how we still can do that. But it's important to also highlight that, yes, while there may be instances where police don't respond, there are others that they do. So I think a time like this definitely calls us to still utilize the systems, even if we feel, well, they will not respond. We don't know that.
And in this situation where the abuser may be someone attached to a security force in the country, a neighbor might be fearful to call, the spouse themselves might be fearful to call.
Well, in that instance, I think at the end of the day, one of the challenges that the work with adults bring is the issue of self-determination. And so in that instance, if the person themselves, they do not make the calls, then the entities will not be able to respond because these are adults. When it comes to children now, it's completely different because there is the mandatory reporting mechanism that is in law for specific professions such as teachers, counselors, social workers, police officers, and to a certain extent, even the general public and a moral responsibility. So at some point, we need to be the ones who ensure that we protect persons who are unable to protect themselves. And as much as difficult it is, because I have experienced it, where I personally made the decision to make the call and support someone and had negative feedback and experiences as a result. But at the end of the day, our goal is to ensure protection for those individuals, especially children. I highlight as well children because often in the discussion of domestic violence, we do not include children. And once domestic violence is there, many times child abuse exists as well from the perpetrator as well. So we need to be able to also be very cognizant of that. But definitely utilize the services that are available, contact the police to request help, especially in emergency situations. If there is an emergency, I would tell you call the police first instead of anybody else.
Okay. And so you've given great tips before. You said, create things like code words that the kids know or the neighbors know, or special codes that maybe they will know that you're in a crisis situation. Teach the kids how to call the police if necessary. And finding even safe corners in the house that maybe you can hide. Can we go through some of them so that anybody at home who's watching, who probably is really fearful of having a violent outburst, can imagine what they can do?
Right. Often in those situations, people already know what are some of the triggers before the incident actually or the blowout actually happens. And so it's important to begin looking at what are the things that are used, whether it's only physical, sometimes only their hands, or whether they use anything else to inflict that violence. It's important to, as much as possible, hide those weapons. And I always say where possible, because often when we look at the situations that families find themselves in, the choices and options are not that much. And being able to, first of all, define or come up with a safety route to come out of the house. Mm-hmm. That is a priority. Because even if you can't hide any weapons, at least being able to know what is the best route for me to leave that house if I can at that time. And being able to, again, define spaces or people that can at least help you, because sometimes in those moments there's nothing that individuals can do, and often that's why they end up in harm's way. They don't have access to telephone to call anyone. They don't have people who that they can come up with code words or signs or images to request help. And so this is where I think it's important for us to then bring those messages in the media, through text blasts, in conversations with individuals, and for the public to be very aware of what is going on around them, and being able to provide that support, because often persons in those situations have been living in them for quite a long time, and they themselves might not know what they can do. And so bringing in someone from outside can help them be able to identify those things. And I keep saying each case is unique, each case is individual. And so their experiences may vary. The things that one can do, another person will not be able to do it, because it might place them further at risk of more violence.
And I think it's very important that you said that, because one of the things that isn't often discussed is that it's a very common feature of an abusive relationship that the abuser will cut the victim off from, friends and family and outside persons. So it is harder for them to make contact if and when they do want to get out.
Yeah, and one of the things I know that a lot of there's and I know we asked the question about when the police officer is the perpetrator, and we've had quite a lot of cases in that. So we're definitely working with the police department in being able to identify mechanisms that can bring those persons to justice. And not only that, because another side of the coin is also working with those perpetrators. Those perpetrators did not become like that on their own. As a society, through the messaging that we have given our children, the way that we have raised them, we have made them to be who they are. And yes, at the time of making choices of perpetrating violence, it is your own, but we have to recognize that the social norms and upbringings often add to the mix, and letting them think that as individuals, they have a right to inflict violence because they might be the head of the households, or as men, they have the ultimate power, and as men, they are the only ones that need to make decisions. And often when those values and attitudes that kind of make them feel as if they're losing who they are, those are instances when often they react through violence, because they feel that violence is the only way that they can retain that power and control. So definitely the inequalities that exist in our society are the foundation of why things like domestic violence and child abuse and sexual violence exist. Because it's not only domestic violence as well, it's sexual violence and everything that is happening.
Yeah. So, Cynthia, of course, does this also mean that this could be an opportune time for new cases of domestic violence? In other words, maybe you're already in a toxic relationship, but being together 24 hours a day with the kids and whatever other issues you're facing, that you may experience it for the first time? Is that part of what I'm hearing from you?
It could be possible, because we've been talking about the different forms of violence within domestic violence. In general, we have to look at the broad aspect of it, which is gender-based violence in communities. And again, that includes the human trafficking component, that includes sexual violence outside of homes, as well child abuse and those particular forms. But definitely these type of situations where we're confined, and honestly, the reality is that as families, we spend a lot of time outside of the home. We don't spend a lot of time inside, from the minute we wake up, we either go to work, our children go to school. And so the reality is that we don't know how to interact with one another. And then I can speak from experience as well. Sometimes it is being together that we begin to look at what are the different issues that families face, but they don't have the tools to deal with those issues. And so it's important that we use this also as opportunities to look at what are some ways that our education system can and make changes that can contribute to families interacting in a more positive ways. Communication tools, activities that families can do together. Unfortunately, a lot of times we sit around when we party. Alcohol is a part of the mix. That is another trigger. So how do we?
And there's a lot of drinking happening right now while people are not working. I mean, again, if we use the data from other parts of the world, we know that that's what happens in a lockdown.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, it is the issue of domestic violence, sexual violence, gender-based violence, and a whole is way more than just some of these things. It's the fear and the inequality, as I mentioned, that exists within our society. And unfortunately, women and girls and other vulnerable populations really feel the brunt of it because they are not in spaces where they feel empowered or they feel they have enough information or they can even make those decisions themselves. So at the end of it, we have to expand the conversation as well and not just focus on domestic violence and that, but look at what are the causes, what are the things that need to change. And a lot of it has to do with the way we see women, with the way we see families relate to one another. And at the end of the day is looking at ways that we can decrease the inequalities that exist and allow people to be able to have much more options that they have at the moment.
So for people who are watching, and I would only imagine the fear that they have, knowing that they have a few more weeks to go being locked down, what's your advice to them? They may be genuinely worried about whether or not they'll survive or be able to live through the next few weeks or be able to stay out of physical harm.
If they feel that their safety is at risk, it is important to then contact the Women's Department. As I said, one of the strategies that the Ministry of Human Development has implemented is a on-call system where people can, once they contact the police, and of course you have to use the mechanisms that are in place because at the end of the day, no matter whatever issues there are, the police are the ones who are legally mandated to respond. And so if there are those instances, contact the police. There is the 911 and also the 0800 A Way Out, which is a hotline, often not used as much, but we call people, urge people to use it. This is a hotline that is manned 24 hours. Either police officers are the ones who respond to the calls directly or operators. But once a call is made, then police, from the referral process, they need to respond either by going to the house and providing that support for that person, or if persons come to the police station to request help, then the police provide that support, either liaising them with medical services or with the Women's Department to access safe spaces. And while we do have limited safe spaces, the Women's Department and the ministry overall are really working very hard to identify places within each of the districts where people can go to temporarily, at least for a while, to ensure their safety. Because when we look at issues of domestic violence, we have to look at safety, health, and also confidentiality. Because this experience has proven how much people want to know information that is basically none of their business. And so we need to be able to literally ask the community to respect that confidentiality of persons and be able not to contribute to the issues that are already in place. Once you follow the advice of the Ministry of Health as it relates to COVID-19, then most likely you will not be contracting the virus. But of course, if you don't, then you have a higher risk. And so people need to be able to contact the police. Women's Department, it has an on-call service where they provide emergency housing for those persons as well. And then they begin providing psychosocial support for these persons. And while they're in these safe spaces, and later on when the person leaves. No matter whether they choose to go back or not, that support is extended to the person.
Of course. And just one final call, of course, if a woman or a person who's being abused, and we also know that children are also really vulnerable in this time, the neighbors and the community can play their part, and it's not a time for maybe you've reported before and they went back, but I'd imagine the plea is don't give up on them, right?
Right. It is the call that you make might save that child's life, might save that individual's life. And when it comes to children, then the police directly liaises with the Department of Human Services, who is the entity that deals with protection of children. And so it's important for persons to understand these processes and know who are the responders to these different issues. And so we'll be putting out some information there that describes the referral pathway, and also being able to provide numbers and people can call and in support of the persons that are in need.
Cynthia, thank you so much for bringing this situation to the forefront so that we're all aware of the risks that exist in some households. And I really hope that the people who are living in the situation, and of course the neighbors and family members, are paying attention as well. We all need to pay attention and look out for our neighbors.
Definitely, and for them to know that they are not alone.
Yeah.
They're not alone. There are services, and honestly, when we look at the situation in Belize and the responses in Belize, as much as we think they're not enough, we are better off from many other countries. Right. We have legislation, we have supportive mechanisms, and so it's important for you not to feel alone, yeah, and be able to begin looking at spaces for you to feel safe.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and best of luck.
So,
all right.
See you as well.
There you have it. That's something we didn't quite think about, the threats of violence within the household for both between spouses, for the children, but something that we do have to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's an absolutely necessary conversation, and we hope that if you are watching at home, whether you are in a situation or if you know of one or have observed one recently, you do heed Cynthia's advice. Take advantage of the services which are open, which are still open, and make a call that could potentially save a life.
Yeah, don't judge. Just imagine that you might be the difference between somebody staying alive and not. And so we hope that is something that you will carry with you. And if you are in a home where you feel unsafe, and we understand, no judgment, sometimes it's not as easy to leave as people want to say it is. Call the Women's Department, create your safety plan, so if you do end up in an outburst of violence, that you have an idea of what you're going to do and you can keep yourself and your children safe. We're going to go ahead and take a break now. When we come back, we'll be talking to representatives of the Mercy Clinic about what they're doing for the elderly that they serve. So please stay tuned.
COVID-19 update was brought to you by Full Tech Systems. You'll come for the price, but stay for the service.